Good evening, and welcome to the Mill Valley Historical Society's First Wednesday Speaker Presentation, an event we host on the first Wednesday of every month. My name is Deborah Schwartz, and I am director of the First Wednesday Speaker Series on behalf of the Mill Valley Historical Society and Mill Valley Public Library. Tonight's presentation is titled Southern Marin's Portuguese Roots with Sausalito historian Mike Moyle. Also with us tonight is history librarian Natalie Snoyman. Natalie was away for quite some time, and now she's back. And we're all very pleased to have you back, Natalie. And as always, thanks for helping to host tonight's event. And of course, we want to thank our longtime partner, the Mill Valley Public Library, for allowing us to host our series in this safe and accessible format. Before we begin, I want to say to those of you in the audience who are already members of the Mill Valley Historical Society, thank you for your generosity and interest. Your membership allows us to continue our efforts to infuse history into the present through our speaker series, oral interviews, history walks, history plaques, and the collaboration to restore and return to Mill Valley Engine Number 9, the last remaining locomotive from the Mount Tamalpais Scenic Railroad. For those of you who are not yet members, please join us. Membership ensures that you will be alerted to future talks such as tonight's and our annual Walk into History that takes place on the Memorial Day weekend. You'll be receiving emails from Chuck Olenberg's charming Mill Valley History vignettes, and you'll be updated about other historical events in our town and nearby. Membership to our organization is so affordable and just a click away on the Mill Valley Historical Society website. For practical purposes, the audience must be muted for this webinar, but functional tools are located at the bottom of your screen to help us communicate with each other. If you can't see them now, just hover your cursor over the area and they should appear. Now look for the chat icon. The chat tool allows you to post comments, say hello to friends, and add substantive information during this presentation. Now look for the Q&A option. The Q&A option is where you can post questions you may have about tonight's presentation, and I'll address those questions to Mike after his talk. But if you have comments or personal stories to share, the chat room is the best place for that. Tonight's talk will last about an hour, and after we'll take time for questions and comments from the audience. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Mill Valley Historical Society website in about 3 or 4 days. Just go to our website, look for events, select First Wednesday Lecture Series, and you'll find tonight's recording as well as many others. Since the early 19th century, the Portuguese American community has had a significant impact on Southern Marin. Arriving first as crew members on New England whaling ships, and later immigrants followed and became active in Marin's early businesses, particularly dairy ranches. By 1888, the community formed a fraternal organization, today's Sausalito Portuguese Cultural Center. Tonight's guest speaker, Mike Moyle, is here to discuss this history, with emphasis on the cluster of over 30 Portuguese dairies at the southern end of the county, and also touch on the Marin Dairy Project, which has identified almost 400 dairies that have operated throughout the county. But Mike Moyle grew up in Hawaii. However, he's been in Sausalito now for over 40 years. Previously a partner at a San Francisco international law firm specializing in U.S.-Japan business transactions, he became active in local history primarily through the Sausalito Historical Society and as the lead historian at the Sausalito Portuguese Cultural Center. He is now collaborating with historian Dewey Livingston on a project to identify all Marin County dairies. Historians are often led by a particular passion or interest. For example, some may prefer to learn human history through the study of language or religion. I prefer the lens of Earth systems and the lifeways of Indigenous people. Mike, He likes food. Some historians study maps, census reports, and military records. Mike studies menus, recipes, and food production. He feasts his way through time, much like a wild animal that comes to know the forest while searching for truffles. Please, won't you give a warm welcome to Mike Moyle. Hi, Mike.
Hey, thank you very much. That's the best introduction I've ever had.
I hoped it wouldn't offend you.
Oh, not at all.
Okay.
All right, well, I'm going to start sharing my screen here.
Okay.
And we'll get going.
Okay, thank you so much. So glad to have you.
All right, well, good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Moyle, and at the moment I'm sitting here in Sausalito, not far away from the building you can see here in the slide, which is the Portuguese Cultural Center on Caledonia Street. We'll talk a little bit about the center later in the presentation, as well as what IDESST means. I know that there are a few people who may be participating this evening who are from out of state and even possibly out of the country. Here is where Marin County is, and we are going to be focusing this evening primarily on the southern part of the county, not necessarily because that's the only place where there were Portuguese immigrants in Marin, but simply as a matter of expediency. Here's a shot we can see from the top of Mount Tam looking south in Marin County. And this is really the area that we're going to be focusing on this evening. Mill Valley down here at the lower left, and then Tiburon, Belvedere, Angel Island to the left, Sausalito here in the center with San Francisco beyond, and then the Marin Headlands that will have a significant role in our discussion this evening. This area was originally part of 2 of the 21 ranchos that were granted during the area's Mexican period. One, Rancho Cordillera del Presidio, which is where Tiburon and a part of Mill Valley is today, was granted in 1834 to John Reed. Unfortunately, we don't have a picture of him, so we have a picture of his adobe somewhat run down. And the second one, Rancho Sausalito, and yes, it was spelled with a C, that was granted to William Richardson in 1838. The history of the Portuguese here in Marin is really the history of the Azorians. Now, the Azores in Portuguese are the Azores would be os Açores. And Açores means hawk or hawks in Portuguese. And that's why the Açores or the Azores, although they are part of Portugal, are an autonomous region. And this is the flag of the Azores, which has the hawk and then 9 stars representing the 9 islands of the Azores. You can see here, the Azores are about 900 miles off the coast of Portugal. Portugal, as we know it today, is comprised of the mainland, the Azores, and then also the islands of the Madeiran archipelago. From the Azores, though, the island that is most significant, most important for Sausalito's early Portuguese history was the island of St. George, or São Jorge, as it's called in Portuguese, which is this long, skinny island you can see here, somewhat foreboding at least on the north end, or northwest end, where you can see these severe cliffs coming down to the ocean. It's not a particularly big island. You can see here in the chart that São Jorge is only about 10% of the total area of the Azores. And back in the 1800s, the period we're looking at was only about 7.2% of the total Azorean population. However, at least here in Marin, it played a outsized role. Here's another shot of São Jorge superimposed on Marin, just to give you a flavor for how large it is. Now, why did the Azorians come and how did they get here? In some ways, it's really a historic accident. The New Bedford whalers, when the whaling industry was just getting started in New England, initially went out into the Atlantic pursuing whales. They went almost due east. And when they got to the Azores, they found that that was a fertile whaling ground. Of course, the problem with whaling is that it's soon depleted. So they had to go further and further south. The other thing, of course, that they found there was both an opportunity to reprovision their ships, as well as a willing population that was eager to sign on to become crew members. So many Azorians over the years, and you can see 1765 was when they got to the Azores, many Azorians became crew members on New England whalers and then joined them on their voyages, initially to the South Atlantic, then into the Pacific around 1787, and then ultimately all the way up to California and into San Francisco Bay around 1820. And you can see here a quote from Herman Melville in Moby Dick that indicates what he thought of the ability of the Azorian whalers. Now, when the whalers first came to the Bay Area in perhaps as early as the 1820s, San Francisco, of course, this was well before the gold rush. There really wasn't much going on in San Francisco. So they would often come to Sausalito, both because the harbor here at the south end of Sausalito, which was called Whalers Cove, provided both wood, an excellent supply of water, and other provisions, and then a very gentle beach where they could do some repairs on their ships as necessary. This picture here is from the late 1800s of the same area in southern Sausalito. You can see how undeveloped it was, of course, at that time. Now, the whalers came, but why did the other Azorians come later? Well, of course, Marin, Sausalito, Southern Marin, and all of Marin turned into an economic hub in the 1800s, due primarily to, at least in Sausalito's case, its role as a transportation hub, initially for the ferry that ran from Sausalito to San Francisco starting in 1868. And then just a few years later, the train that ran north from Sausalito all the way to Sonoma, primarily to be able to bring lumber that was harvested in Sonoma down to Sausalito and then across to San Francisco to use in building. This is a shot showing the Sausalito train terminal and the ferry terminal in the early 1900s. And then a bit later, this is 1936, both the passenger ferry terminal, the rail terminal, and then even a very significant auto ferry terminal here at the base of Princess Street. Actually, this is an interesting picture in 1936 because the following year, the Golden Gate Bridge was opened. And by 1941, the beginning of 1941, the ferry system was gone, as well as the entire passenger rail system in Marin. However, in the 1800s, you can see here the route that the rails took on their way up to Sonoma. And on this map, you can see the land here is indicated dairy and agricultural land all the way up along the rail line. As Deb mentioned, I'm working under a good friend of mine named Dewey Livingston, who many of you know as one of the premier historians in Marin County. Dewey has done, going back decades, a tremendous amount of research on dairies in Marin, initially on the Point Reyes Peninsula, but then all through central Marin. So Dewey and I have been collaborating to try and identify the locations of all the dairies that ever existed in Marin. And by this time, we're up to about 400. The icons on this map show about 340 of those 400. And also who worked on those dairies, going back to, at least in the case of Point Reyes, maybe to the 1850s. We have some pretty good information about some of them. In other cases, we don't have as much information as we would like. But this is something that I'm very interested in because many of these were operated by Portuguese. And why the Portuguese? Well, dairying was something in the Azores that they were very, very familiar with. These are 4 random shots from the Azores showing happy cows there. And of course, if you're somebody who knows how to milk cows, but do not speak English, working on a dairy where there may be other Portuguese there is an excellent opportunity to break in. So I will say that we mentioned earlier that there were the 2 ranchos, the one that was granted to William Richardson, Rancho Sausalito, and the adjoining one granted to Reed, the Rancho Corte Madera del Presidio. The land ownership patterns in those 2 areas has been very, very different over the years. This shows the Rancho Sausalito as it was when William Richardson acquired it in 1838, just under 20,000 acres. And at that point, Richardson owned the whole thing. Skipping ahead to 1880, Richardson died, I think it's 1856, and his lawyer, Samuel Throckmorton, through various nefarious means, ended up owning a significant part of the Rancho Sausalito. This shows Throckmorton's ownership in the yellow line in 1880. At that point, he owned about almost 15,000 acres. And Throckmorton decided he was going to exploit this by renting it out to tenant farmers, tenant dairy farmers. So he divided this up into 24 dairies and hired people to come and rent the property and operate dairies there. As it turned out, virtually all of them were Portuguese. Now, that's not to say, looking down here at the bottom, this shows the situation in 1925. By that time, much of this property had been subdivided and sold in the old Rancho Sausalito. So this green area, the areas inside the green, show parcels that had been purchased by Portuguese. And so the Portuguese at that point, by 1925, owned about 41% of the total land area of the original Rancho Sausalito. And every one of these icons shows the location of a dairy. Now, of course, there were also these dairies over here in the former Rancho Corte Madera del Presidio, the Reed property, but much of the real estate here was owned by descendants of the Reed family, although the actual dairy operation was conducted by Portuguese. And this is yet another map showing this area here in Southern Marin, where all of the dairies were Portuguese. And I should have said at the beginning, as Deb mentioned, this presentation is going to be available, I believe, on the Mill Valley Library's YouTube channel. We're also going to be sharing several pages of additional resource materials that will have links to materials with much more information about all of these subjects. This is just an example of one fellow from São Jorge named Manuel Fagundes, who came in 1888. Over the course of his life here, he passed away in 1854. He ended up working on 13 different dairies. Initially as an employee, just simply a milker. Then once he built up a little capital, he became a partner in some of these dairies where he would own his string of cows and would partner with other Portuguese in operating the dairy. And then ultimately, he was able to acquire real property and was able to operate his dairy on property he owned. Ultimately, you can see here the Fagundes Dairy up here, and which is just south of Lucas Valley Road here in Marin. That was where he ended up. But this is not an unusual history for these Portuguese dairymen. And so when we're trying to figure out who they were, you're talking about 150 years times perhaps 4 partners per dairy, with these people coming and going during that period. It ends up being quite a task to trace all of them. We are very lucky. I refer here to the Marin binders. There are some excellent resources available on the Novato Historical Guild website with a great deal of information about the operations of the dairies around the 1950 period. Today, very little remains, at least in Southern Marin, that gives you any indication that there were dairies here. These are 2 of the remaining real structures in Southern Marin. At the upper left here, we have the Miwok Stables, which was the Cunha Lopes dairy for many years. And then at the lower right, we have the Golden Gate Dairy, which was operated by several different families. I think the latest being the Lopes family, a different Lopes from the one in Tennessee Valley. But today, that's also an equestrian facility, the Ocean Riders of Marin. And we're hoping that we'll be able to put a small Portuguese interpretive center there. But as we travel around Marin today, it's easy to overlook exactly how significant the Portuguese population here was. So a critical mass and the development of the IDESST. This is some examples of advertisements that appeared in the inaugural issue of the Sausalito News in 1885. And you can see here, these are all Portuguese individual, Dias and Silva, Santos, Mancebo, and Cordoza, and another Silva being the most common Portuguese name. But 1885, by this point, the Portuguese were already becoming quite active in commerce here in Sausalito and in other cities, in addition to being active in the dairies in the surrounding area. We think that perhaps around 30% of the Southern Marin population at that time was of Portuguese descent. They were also quite active in local politics. These are just some of the individuals who were here in Sausalito, elected as trustees and other city officials over the years. I'd like to say that Sausalito's incorporation in 1893 was 5 years after the Portuguese IDESST was formed. But they were very active in political activities throughout the county as well. So the IDESST, I promised Deb I would tell you what it means. It's an acronym which stands for the Irmandad, which means Brotherhood do Divino Espírito Santo, which is the Divine Holy Spirit, e Santíssima Trindade, which is the Holy Trinity, and formed in 1888. That's quite a mouthful. So it was generally referred to by its acronym. A few years ago, we decided that its acronym was a little bit hard to understand and perhaps misleading. Some people would refer to the call as the IDESST, which we didn't like much. So we've now begun to call it the Sausalito Portuguese Cultural Center, which is quite in keeping with its role today. This was our first president, Manuel Bajeiros, who became president in 1888 when the hall was formed. It was initially an informal organization. It was incorporated in 1904, at which point Antonio Nunes Moyle was the president of the hall. Now, this is one of my favorite historic shots of Sausalito. It was taken by a fellow named George Reed in 1888, and it shows the area of Sausalito that includes the Portuguese Hall that was built in that same year. So Reed must have taken this picture sometime in the latter part of 1888. Kind of hard to figure out what's going on here. So here we go. So the Portuguese Hall, St. Mary's Star of the Sea Church, which has played an important role for the Portuguese community over the years. It's now in a different location, as we'll see. Caledonia Street down here, which used to come at the end and go up the hill. The old Richardson School. Da Silva Island, that we'll encounter again a bit later in the program. Waldo Point over here. And perhaps most striking that people will notice, this trestle that extended across Richardson Bay, because when the North Coast Pacific Railroad first started operations, the route north through Marin crossed Richardson Bay right here. It was only in 1884 when they completed the Alto Tunnel between Mill Valley and Larkspur that they were able to reroute the rail route, and it went then up and out through the Alto Tunnel and further north. But can you imagine going across this, what must have been an incredibly rickety trestle, back in the early 1880s? Not so fun. I gave you a sense that things have changed a bit here in Sausalito. We'll see in a moment, the Portuguese Hall is still there, although it's hard to see behind the trees here in this picture. St. Mary's has moved since 1888, but it was located right here at the top of this is Bonita and Litho Street, the very steep Litho Street hill coming up here. So there's been a bit of development in the intervening years. I should say that I love taking drone pictures and to try to take them in a way that I can compare them to historic pictures. And you'll find in the materials that I've prepared that are connected or will be passed out with the video that I'd given an earlier presentation where there are a number of these historic photos of the Sausalito area with drone counterparts. So the old hall. Here it was. I think this, I can't really see my screen here. I think this was 1948. This was the time of our Holy Ghost festival, the Festa, and the Queens were coming down the stairs here in the hall. And here it is today at 131 Filbert. It's the home of the Sausalito Christian Fellowship Organization. A beautiful, beautiful building. Can't figure out how they used to get thousands of people in there, though, at the time of the Festa. The Sausalito Portuguese Cultural Center, our organization, is certainly not the only Portuguese hall in the area. This map shows some of the others nearby. Novato, we'll see a bit later. There's also one in Petaluma, in Sebastopol, Benicia, and Vallejo. There were two others in Marin County, in Tamales and Point Reyes, but they went out of operation some time ago. These all have very close ties, and we share events with these other halls as well. So just to make clear, over the years, there were two very distinct waves of Azorean immigration. This chart shows those waves. One was starting, as you can see, really ramped up after the gold rush. And this was the period where probably we had most of the folks coming in here into Marin to work as dairy farmers. This chart, by the way, shows all Portuguese immigration to the United States, which was perhaps about 90% from the Azores. But here in the United States, most of the immigration from Portugal, from the Azores, Madeira, Cabo Verde, and other parts of the Portuguese Empire, came either to the New England area, going back to the whaling era, here to California, or to Hawaii, where I grew up and how I got to know a lot of about Portuguese culture. In Hawaii, it was primarily in connection with coming to work initially on the sugar, in the sugar industry there. But you can see here, there was a definite fall off after the 1920s. And that was due to, of course, the period of somewhat anti-immigrant sentiment represented by this cartoon here. And it ended up with the Calvin Coolidge signing the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924, which imposed quotas in the case of European countries, including Portugal, which was subject to a 3% quota, and then also absolute restrictions for immigration from parts of Asia. That lasted for 41 years until 1965, when Lyndon Johnson signed the Hart-Celler Act, and then immigration picked up again. However, there was another factor that was relevant for the immigration from the Azores. And then in 1958, there was a huge volcanic eruption called the Capelinhos volcano that happened at the western end of the island of Faial, which is this island here. That is the island of Picu in the background there. But you can see here a couple of shots of the eruption. And the ash, the earthquakes from the continuing eruption really wreaked havoc with many of the homes and businesses of the Azorians, particularly in the central island group here. So a couple of senators, John Pastore from Rhode Island and this guy named Kennedy from Massachusetts, got together and they passed the Azorian Refugee Act of 1958, which enabled several thousand Azorians. This is, of course, in advance of Lyndon Johnson signing the Hart-Celler Act, several thousand Azorians to come to the United States in excess of the quotas that were otherwise in place then. So we had a whole nother wave of folks who were able to come here from the Azores. And that's certainly something that we've benefited from a great deal here in California. Now we're going to turn to the Holy Spirit Festival, the Festa do Espírito Santo, which is the high point of, I think it's fair to say, for every Portuguese organization here in California. This, I'm going to refer to it as the Festa. The Festa dates back to the period of Portugal's Queen Isabel, who was the queen. She was the wife of King Denis. And she seems to have been a pretty remarkable person, known for her generosity and her general compassion for the poor. She began to encourage the celebration of a festival that honored the Holy Ghost, the Holy Spirit, and was held in, and it involved the crowning of a poor person, and then also distribution of food and other resources to the poor in the community. But although it started there in Portugal, over the years it was really not celebrated as much in mainland Portugal as it became to be celebrated in the Azores. And so when the Azorians came, no matter where they came from in the Azores, they brought with them this tradition of the Festa, the Holy Spirit Festival. So in 1886, here in Sausalito, there was a sufficient critical mass that they decided that they would celebrate the Festa right in downtown Sausalito in this building here, which was a building that was owned by two brothers named Lawrence, who had changed their name from Lourenço. They were from São Jorge. And so the festival was held here, the Festa. And remember, this is 1886, 2 years before the center, our center was established in 1888. And this is a shot of St. Mary's Church that we saw earlier, which is a kind of out of the view here up the hill to the left where the Mass would have been held. Today, the Festa has many moving parts. Certainly, I hope that many of you have had a chance to see it or otherwise participate in it. It includes a procession that goes from our center to St. Mary's, which is uphill, as anybody who has walked it knows. It takes place in Sausalito always on Pentecost Sunday, which is the seventh Sunday after Easter, and accordingly, the actual date varies from year to year. We always include a marching band. Again, brass marching bands were something very important in the Azores, and almost every village had its own marching band. We're very fortunate to have the Lusitania band. Lusitania, you may know, is the Roman term for Portugal, just as Caledonia is for Scotland. Lusitania is for Portugal. We have the Lusitania band who marches in our. We have queens, although this was not really part of the tradition in the Azores. It's become very much part of the tradition here in the festas in California. We have in Sausalito a big queen and a little queen, and each one has a couple of attendants. They wear these beautiful capes, and those are quite heavy, as any queen will tell you. Here are a couple of shots from our archives looking back at past festas in Sausalito. It was perhaps even a more significant activity back then than it is today, in part because here in Sausalito, they actually celebrated the festa on 2 consecutive weekends, Pentecost Sunday and the following Trinity Sunday. You remember I said that IDESST includes Santísima Trindad, or the Holy Trinity. So the Sausalito group celebrated twice, on Pentecost and Trinity Sunday. So in the early days, there were 2 queens on 2 consecutive weekends. Now we also have a Queen Isabel in the festa, and those of you who will come, it's sometimes kind of easy to miss her because she wears there's a young woman who always is seen as Queen Isabel, and the way to identify her is, at least in Sausalito, she wears a blue cape and carries roses. And roses are the indispensable icon that you will always see associated with Queen Isabel. There's a legend. If we had more time, I would tell you about it. You can find it in the materials. St. Mary's Church, of course, is where we go for the Mass after hiking up the hill. Here's a shot of the Mass in St. Mary's. You can see the Queens here in front of the altar. St. Mary's has a couple of statues donated over the years by the Portuguese community. I think you probably know who this is. Queen Isabel was a saint, and this is sainted Queen Isabel with her roses. And then over here is a statue representing the apparition that occurred at Fatima in Portugal in the early 1900s. And both of these statues were donated by the Portuguese community. The windows at St. Mary were replaced just a few years ago, but before that, there were many of the windows there that reflected members of the Portuguese community in whose memory they had been donated. When you get back to the hall, this is, I think, everybody, or my favorite part of the ceremony. The Holy Spirit is often represented on Pentecost, its descent, by a white dove. In Portuguese, alva pomba. And so part of the celebration at any festa is that the big queen will release a white dove, and hopefully it flies up into the blue sky. Some years are more successful than others, but I think this was a very particularly good year. It's a great shot. This is showing a slide to show the importance of the dairies over the years to the festa. It was very customary for people on the dairies, and everybody else for that matter, to make a promise or a vow at the time of the festa. And as part of that, on the dairies, to donate a cow. Now we're talking about the dairies going all the way up through Stinson, even to Bolinas over the years, and well before the years of ground transportation. So it was necessary sometime a few days before the festa to send riders out, and they'd go out and round up the cows and actually herd them into Sausalito. So here they are actually coming down. This is Caledonia Street right here at the corner of Pine. So this building in the background, you can see here is the Lawrence Brothers building where the first festa was held. They then swung around and came up and came down Filbert Street here. And this picture was taken from right in front of the old hall. You can see the cows are coming down the street here. Now they're heading for this barn over here in Corral, which was on Olima Street on property that was owned by the hall. And they would be taken there. There would be an auction. Some of them would be sold through the auction or sold and resold. And then the ones that were not quite as lucky would end up becoming part of the festa in a different way. That particular part of Sausalito that was the corral and the barn for the hall is today part of the Rotary Village. This property was sold by the hall to the Rotary organization here in Sausalito and was converted into senior housing, which it is today. But the old barn still stands in somewhat remodeled form, and it is called the Chamarrita Room. Now, I should say that in Sausalito and probably many other places, the festa, although it was generally called the festa by the Portuguese population, was often known as the Chamarrita, or in Portuguese, the Chamarrita, which is the name of an Azorian folk dance that was always danced at the festa late into the evening. And so when they named the room here at this ceremony, they named it the Chamarrita Room. Perhaps the thing that many people remember about the festa, as Deb said, I love my food, is the sopas, which is the dish that's traditionally served at the hall using all those cows that we saw, at least in the past. We don't slaughter them today, but this is the traditional lunch that is served to all comers. There's no charge. And so this, again, in the tradition of Queen Isabel, is giving back to the community. And this gentleman in the background, you can see here, Manuel Azevedo, was our president for several years. He's the chef and owner of a couple of excellent Portuguese restaurants up in Sonoma that I would recommend to you, and there's more information about them in the materials. For dessert, you might expect to have some sweet rice pudding decorated with either a crown or a dove sprinkled on in cinnamon. Now, as we said, there are many of these Holy Ghost, many of these Portuguese organizations in Marin, in California. This was a book that came out a few years ago describing all of them. There were about 150 over the years all through California, from almost to the Oregon border down to San Diego. Most of them were here in central California, as you can see on the map. There are probably about 90 that are active today. Now, Sausalito is the third oldest of all of them, behind only Half Moon Bay and San Pablo. The newest thing that has happened for us here in Sausalito was the establishment of a sister city relationship in 2013 with a city called Cascais, which is on the mainland of Portugal. You can see here on the map, it's just on the coast here. This is Lisbon, Portugal's capital here, which is on the banks of the Tejo River. The Tejo flows out here to the Atlantic, and if you take a quick right turn, you'll get to Cascais. Lovely resort city, and we're very fortunate to have it as our sister city, the third of our sister cities. You'll see here, I just pointed out these stone mosaics here along the beach. In Portuguese, these are referred to as calçadas, and we'll see them again in just a moment. The Sister City signing agreement was in 2013. Folks came from Cascais and actually participated in the Festa, which had stopped here in front of the Plaza Viña del Mar. The activities of the Sister City organization here include a youth sailing exchange every other year. The kids go back and forth between here and Cascais to participate in sailing programs sponsored by the respective yacht clubs. But we also have here in Sausalito regularly a Fado night, Fado being the traditional Portuguese singing and instrumental music, which is really, really beautiful. In 2018, Cascais decided they wanted to have a gift to Sausalito. And so they sent us 13 tons of stones in 4 colors to be able to create our own calzada project in downtown Sausalito. So it was, the site was selected in front of what was then the Bank of America building. It's since become the Sausalito Center for the Arts. Work was done. In addition to the stones, Cascais sent us these 2 wonderful individuals, Marcos Paulino and Luis Santinho, who are professional calceteiros, and that's the profession in Portugal. They are city employees of Cascais, the profession that installs and maintains the calçadas all over the city, which is a big job. So you'll see them here hard at work. It took them about a week to install all of the stones. And remember, they would pick up, one of them would pick up each one of those stones, chip it into shape, and then tap it into place here in the mosaic. And here they are with the finished product. Later in the summer, Prime Minister Costa came from Portugal to help with the dedication of the plaza, as well as some of our friends from the Cascais city government. Here is the plaza today. You can see it here in front of the building, right along Bridgeway in the center of downtown. It's also just a great spot given our Portuguese history, because all of these buildings across the street from the plaza are very much part of the Portuguese heritage, including most notably the building here, the 3-story Victorian that was built by no other than Manuel Barreiros, our first president. There was even a Hotel Lisbon that was right where, not too far from where Pogios is today. Unfortunately, all of these buildings burned down in a fire in the early 1890s. So what are we doing to try to preserve our Portuguese heritage here in Marin? In 2014, we created a self-guided walking tour through Sausalito and out into Tennessee Valley and the headlands. 33 stops. And actually, if you were to go the whole distance, it's about 13 miles. So we always recommend you take it in segments. But this was an effort to identify locations which reflected some aspect of Sausalito and Marin's Portuguese heritage, of which we found many, but we didn't really realize how many were left to be found. Today, we now do a Portuguese walking tour just along Caledonia Street, and this image shows some of the stops that we make there. Every one of these stops has something to do with our Portuguese heritage. There's some overlap with the self-guided walking tour, but I would say less than 25% of the stops here are part of the walking tour. So just showing what additional progress we've made in identifying the roots of Portuguese history here. You can see here the Portuguese Hall in Caledonia, and you can see up here, just by way of the relationship, the old hall, the original hall on Filbert Street. We also do numerous Facebook posts. The way that we have, over the years, shared the results of the research we have done is on the center's Facebook page. I selected just 4 of them to show you here, which all relate to Mill Valley. the Costa Brothers Creamery, which was on Blythedale at Sunnyside, operated for many years. The Victorino family had a establishment at the top of the Dipsy Stairs, where if you were thirsty, either coming or going, you could get something cool to drink. Perhaps the best baseball player in Marin history, Tony Freitas, was born and raised on a dairy where the O'Hanlon Center is today. Manuel Leal, who was one of our center's presidents, a very successful rancher and businessman in Sausalito and Southern Marin, built what was called the Leal building, which is right here at Throckmorton and Miller, where the Equator Coffee is today. But as I say, we've done hundreds of these Facebook posts, and a selection of them is available and links to them available in the resource materials. Also get around to the local schools. This is me. I try to do my best impression of a Portuguese dairyman, and I carry with me my mascot, although it's generally thought of as I'm the mascot for this cow by the kids. We take Portuguese sweetbread. We take cheese from São Jorge, the St. George, Matos St. George cheese factory up in Santa Rosa, and generally have a great time. One of the great things about the Portuguese history with the schools is that almost every school here in Southern Marin sits on the grounds of a former dairy. We also work a great deal with all of the historical societies here in Marin. The nice thing about the Portuguese history of Marin is that it overlaps everywhere you go. And so with each of these, the historical societies, we can usually find something regarding the history of the Portuguese community that is relevant to them. So echoes of Portugal here in Marin. We have the two Portuguese halls, Sausalito, and this is the hall up in Novato. I'll just put a plug in for our Festa, which is going to be Pentecost Sunday, May 28th this year. Novato holds its Festa the week before, so its is on May 21st, Sunday before. Recommend that you go to either or both. We have the Praça de Cascais at the Napa Street Bridgeway intersection in Sausalito. We have this sculpture, Bolinar, Close to the Wind, which was by John Liberton. Bolinar is a Portuguese verb meaning to sail close to the wind. And John was inspired by the triangular lantine sails of the Portuguese caravelas, which were the type of ships that initially went out during the period of the Portuguese discoveries under Prince Henry the Navigator as part of the effort of Portugal to expand the knowledge of the greater world. Dias Ridge Trail, for those of you who are hikers, which extends down from Panoramic Highway, paralleling Route 1, all the way down to Muir Beach. It comes out at the Golden Gate Dairy that we saw earlier. The Dias family were tenant farmers, but then ended up being able to purchase a good deal of the property up here along Panoramic Highway and had a significant ranch right about here. This is Jim Dias, who was another of our past presidents at the center. Rock, or as it's properly pronounced, Rock Morais, was another dairyman who operated the Alto Dairy, which is just above where the Blythedale Whole Foods is today. A few years ago, another of my mentors, Lissa McKee, who's been extremely active with the Mill Valley Historical Society, and I were able to write this piece for the review about Hook and his family and the early Portuguese immigration here to Mill Valley. He ended up being able to purchase the property where Enchanted Knolls is today. And so when that subdivision was developed, they named one of the main streets after him, which intersects with Blythedale. Just a few months ago, the president of Portugal, Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, came to Marin to help with the groundbreaking for a new mural that is being installed along the old rail trail on Tiburon. It is a mural which is intended to honor the Portuguese dairies here. Includes both Portuguese tiles, which are called azulejos, as well as the Portuguese mosaic calçadas that we saw earlier. And if this fellow down here looks familiar, it's because Marcos Molino came back to work on this project in addition to the Praça de Cascais that he'd worked on earlier. But you can see the Little Reed Dairy that operated right there along Tiburon Boulevard. This is a shot from 1931. This is the Little Reed Dairy, and you can see that property. This is Tiburon Boulevard today. Del Mar Middle School is where the dairy used to be, and the mural location is just across the Tiburon Boulevard from that. So really appropriate location. Da Silva Island that we mentioned earlier, the end of the Richardson Bay Bridge. It's not De Silva Island. I don't know, whoever developed the property there apparently didn't do their historical research. I keep meaning to go over there with a chisel and correct that someday. Further north in Marin, you go past the Silvera Ranch, which is still there across from Marinwood. And then a second Silvera Ranch further up, where the Silvera Ranch Road is located, just before you get to the Sonoma border. Also, of course, Freitas Parkway, named after Manuel Freitas, who had the Freitas home ranch. Manuel Freitas may have been the most eminent of the members of the Portuguese community in Marin over the years. He and his family then named the area Terra Linda. Again, to note, that's not Tierra, which would be Spanish, Linda. It is Terra Linda, which is beautiful land in Portuguese. These are some of the other locations up there or in Marin County, and we'll list all the time as we find other ones. I wanted just to end today with a story of three dresses. Here we are back at the Alto Y Dairy. This is the dairy that was shown on the flyer for my program this evening. Perhaps a little easier to understand where it is by this comparison, again, with my drone. Here we are in 101 heading south to the Richardson Bay Bridge with Blythedale heading off this direction at Tiburon Boulevard over here. Back in the day, before they opened the Richardson Bay Bridge, to get south, of course, you had to turn right here and see the sign directing you to San Francisco to the right. And this was what was called the Alto Y Dairy, because here there was a Y. You could go left to Tiburon or right to Mill Valley, Sausalito, and on to San Francisco by ferry. A family named Morais, Manuel Morais, no relationship to Roque Morais, although both of them coincidentally came from the small town of Santo Amaro on the island of Pico, operated that dairy for many years. Here's a view of the family in 1930. Dorothy Morais, the youngest daughter, seen here in the picture, ended up being selected as the queen for our festa in 1939. Although in the newspaper she was referred to as Dorothy Morris. We've always had a problem with getting Portuguese names straight. And you'll see here it's referring to the chamarita, the festa, the more popular term for the festa. But here is Dorothy in her gown with a couple of her attendants carrying the crown at the festa. Now, Dorothy had a cousin named Margarita Jorge Terra, who lived in Santo Amaro on the island of Pico. In 1947, Margarita married Victor Nunes. Here they are at their wedding in 1947. Dorothy had sent her dress to Margarita, and Margarita used that to create her wedding gown. Fast forward a few more years, the Nunes family has grown. One of their daughters, named after her mother, Margarita, had her first communion in 1959. And here she is. They managed to use the same dress a third time for Margarita's communion. Skip ahead a few more years. Again, thank you, relaxation of immigration. The Nunes family was able to immigrate here to California. This is Margarita Senior, Margarita Junior, on the occasion of her 95th anniversary, 95th birthday a few years back. Here she is again at her wedding and her birthday. Just the most wonderful person you could imagine with her children. And then here is Margarita Junior, as she has developed, formerly president of the Novato Portuguese Hall and a very, 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 very active member of the Sausalito Hall as well. But here she is at her communion. And a couple of years ago, I took this picture of Margarita holding the picture. Now that's a nice story, but it even goes a little further. If you look over my shoulder here, you'll see this painting that was done by Dorothy Marin. Dorothy turned into a really wonderful painter, and coincidentally, she ended up moving to Kona on the Big Island, where I'm from. That I never knew her there, but when she came back, we got to know each other, and she gave me this painting, which was a painting that she had made with her memories of looking out the kitchen window at the family home on the Alto Y Dairy at the barn in the background. This is a painting of her younger brother, Luis Morais, here. And she also gave me another painting you can see there in the background of her that she painted in Kona on the Big Island. So I think of Dorothy almost every day, and it was such a gift. So thank you so much. And Deb, I fear I might have gone over a bit, but I'd be happy to take any questions. Obrigado, as we say, as males say in Portuguese, it would be obrigada for females, but obrigado. And I'll take questions, Deb.
Oh, hey, great talk. I have a couple questions.
Go.
Well, actually a request. I mean, there were so many dairies in Marin County, and who were they serving, the customer base? This was to a growing San Francisco, I presume.
Right. Well, initially, many of them were very local in nature. The initial dairies were really out on Point Reyes in the 1850s, at a time when you couldn't transport fresh dairy products. So the initial dairies there, and this is something that Dewey has written extensively about, primarily produced butter and cheese, and they would then take that by schooner from Point Reyes into San Francisco. But other dairies would be able to serve maybe the local communities to some extent. But when the railroads opened up, then at least for the dairies that were in some proximity to the railroad, they would be able to ship their fresh dairy products into the San Francisco market. Of course, over the years, there were many changes, and gradually, sanitation regulations changed, transportation changed dramatically, property taxes increased in Southern Marin. So over the years, it ended up being that it was much better, much cheaper, more efficient to produce milk either further north in Marin or even out into the Central Valley, where most of the big dairies are today. But we still have a few dairies, perhaps 20, that are still hanging on up in the northwest part of the county.
What was the last dairy to operate in Mill Valley itself?
In Mill Valley?
Yes, because I remember hiking the Marin Headlands in the 70s, and there were cattle up there.
Yeah, I mean, it probably would have been the dairies. It might have very well been the Alto Y dairies. The Alto Y dairy right there at the intersection with Lifedale. went into the 1950s, the early 1950s. And I think as well, the Alto Dairy, which is the one I mentioned, where above Whole Foods there, operated into the 50s as well. But again, the cards were stacked against them, particularly after the war, when there was a great deal of pressure on building in Southern Marin to build housing. And of course, dairies were unable to compete.
Okay, let's jump into some of the questions. This is from Jill. Did the trestle go to Strawberry Point?
Yes.
This is from Cassandra. Why did the hall move?
Well, the hall was old. It was, I don't know, how many years is it from 1888 to 1953? It was pretty well used. You know, as I mentioned, back in the day, we have newspaper reports that there would be 3,000 or 4,000 people that would attend the festas. The Sausalito Festa was really, really well known, in part because the hall was one of the oldest in California. And people would come from really all over, particularly all over the central California, but the East Bay, to attend the festa. So it wasn't uncommon to have to serve a couple, 3,000 meals. And so, you know, that's a lot of wear and tear on the building over the year. Not to mention all the dancing into the night there. You know, there were some great stories. Deb, I know you've been very involved with the oral history program with the Mill Valley, which I so appreciate because I've been a beneficiary of that. But Tony Brabo and Mary Brabo, who were two oral histories who are on your site, met at a festa at the hall. That's where they saw each other for the first time. And they ended up eloping. And they snuck back to Mill Valley actually on, was it 1927 when the Mount Tam fire happened?
29.
So they ended up being, I think their marriage is supposedly the longest marriage longest period of marriage in Marin, because they both lived almost to 100. Huh. Anyway, sorry for the digression.
Well, there are a lot of Portuguese stories.
There are a lot of those
in the house of a Portuguese family.
I mean, if you're a dairyman, you're out there. Dairy operation, if you're a milker, is 24/7. You know, you don't take any days off. You just don't take any time off at all. And so it was a real joy to be able to escape for a little while, to come into the festa in Sausalito or Nevada or wherever it was, and dance with a woman that maybe, because you've never seen one of those for months, other than maybe the wife of the dairy operator. And so you can imagine why many romances bloomed from those opportunities.
Yes. Okay, here's a question from Program Chair. What happened to the original windows when they were replaced?
At the church, I assume he's referring to. You know, they actually were able to incorporate, they did really an excellent job, I think, in trying to restore them. They were able to incorporate at least some parts of the panes. Some of them they weren't able to restore. But if you look side by side at some of the windows that exist today versus what was there before, you can see that some of the glass was retained. Unfortunately, the names were lost, but there is a large plaque at the church that honors those who were whose names were reflected on the windows earlier.
This is from Renee. Hi, is it possible to search records of membership of the IDESST from the onset to find relatives?
No. And I say that quite bluntly because that's what I kind of I learned with a thud when I started to get into the history of the hall. Unfortunately, the records of the hall that probably go before the 1960s, 1970s have largely been lost. And so we simply don't have records. On the resource page that I've mentioned before, we do have the records of membership of a parallel organization that was called the UPEC, that had a Sausalito chapter, and there probably was a great deal of overlap between that organization and the membership of the hall. So I would refer you to the resource materials and look for the post about the link to the UPEC records.
Okay, good answer. Here's one from my sister, Jan. My sister Debbie and me, your hostess, and I would visit a dairy farm in Fresno, California in the early 1960s. It was owned by my father's friend who was a nurse. She was Portuguese and her name was Mary Freitas. I am wondering now if she could possibly be related to the immigrant Freitas farm in your Sausalito farm seen on plate 18. Were there tendrils going as far as the Central Valley?
Sure, and there we have found quite a few links into the Central Valley because, as I mentioned in the talk, people might start out here in Marin. They might work on a dairy. Probably the number over the years of the people who actually worked here at an early part of their dairying career, who ended up working in Marin for their entire dairy career, was small. And so they would often go to other places, perhaps where they could find land more readily. And so we have several records of families that left Marin and moved to the Central Valley. I should say that for those who don't know today, the most active component of the Portuguese American population in California is in the Central Valley. If you go out to Fresno, Gustine, all of those towns out there, you will find real active Portuguese American populations. Also down in San Diego, which was ended up being folks that came there to work in the tuna industry. But it's very possible. Freitas is not an uncommon name, though. We've been able, using Ancestry.com and so forth, to be able to trace many links. I will say one of the real issues about doing genealogical work involving Portuguese is that there are so many name changes. Many members of the same family use different names. Some siblings would use the name of the father, some of the mother. And so over the years, trying to figure out who's who is a challenge.
Always a challenge when it comes to finding the facts. This is from Antu. Please, what was the name of the dairy that was located where Strawberry Elementary School was located?
It was, that would have been on the property of the Reed, what they called the Big Reed Dairy. There again, that's covered in some of the materials, but again, this I mentioned that the property that was part of the old Rancho Cordemadera del Presidio, had originally been granted to John Reed, stayed in the Reed family, most of it for many generations, and so that property was part of what was called the Big Reed Ranch. There was a Little Reed Ranch. The Little Reed Ranch is the part of the property where the new mural is going to be going in, where Del Mar School is today. There was also a Hilarita Dairy down closer to the Belvedere. And then there was the Eagle Ranch that was owned by Hilarita Lyford. That was the Strawberry Peninsula. So Hilarita actually had two properties, the Hilarita Eagle Dairy, which was strawberry, and then she at the other end of Tiburon Peninsula, she owned Hilarita Dairy.
Okay, thank you for that. Here's from Griffith. You mentioned Golden Gate Dairy at Muir Beach, possibly becoming a Portuguese Historical Cultural Center. What's the story behind that? When might it happen?
Well, we are working with the folks from the Ocean Riders, who are a wonderful group that we've cooperated with on several projects. We have materials that we've put together to display there. We will have to get some approval from the Park Service, and we're hoping that it might be even within this year.
Okay.
I should say it's going to be quite modest, but it will be interesting.
Good. Thank you. Here's from on two again. Mike, where is Kona? Where, I think, in Kona did Dorothy live? And how is her last name spelled? I am here in Kona and am researching the histories of our Kanaka Japanese Portuguese families and lives. I am the ED of Pulama. I'm sorry, I have a little trouble reading this, of Kona Heritage Preservation Council.
Well, that's great. And actually, thank you. I grew up in Pepe'ekeo on the other side of the island from Kona. Dorothy's last name was Williams, and her maiden name, Mirage, but her husband was named Robert Williams. And I know that Dorothy was, as I mentioned, a very good artist. She was instrumental, I understand, in setting up the Kona Artists Guild or organization along those lines. So if you Google Dorothy Williams, you should be able to find some reference to her there in Kona. Unfortunately, I don't know exactly where she lived, but I have been to Kona and enjoyed the sweetbread that is baked by the Portuguese organization there, I think once a week in a stone oven. So mahalo and obrigado for that.
Here's in the comment section, but I think this is a question. What does IDESSI stand for? And how is it different from IDESST?
Yeah, so IDESI is similar to IDESST, but it stands for the first four letters are the same. IDES is so it's the Brotherhood, Irmandad do Divino Espírito Santo, IDES. That part of it is the same as the Sausalito Hall. Sausalito has ST, the Santísima Trindade. I mentioned Trinity Sunday celebration. Novato they stop at the Holy Ghost because they just had the one weekend. And then they wanted to be clear that they were independent of Sausalito, those folks down in Southern Marin. So they threw in a independent, which means independent in Portuguese. I don't mean to suggest there's any rivalry between the two because we cooperate very closely, but there's a slight variation. But many of the Portuguese organizations will have some combination of those SE, IDES, SES. There are lots of those organizations out there.
Here's one from John.
I should say, if I might say, that we offer Portuguese lessons at the center. I have taken some. I can't say that it's done me much good, but it has helped me to at least pronounce Portuguese a little bit better. And I should also say that, as everybody may know, there's quite a difference between the Portuguese that's spoken in mainland Portugal and the Azores and the Portuguese that is perhaps more familiar because more millions of people speak it in Brazil, which is a much more understandable form of Portuguese.
You really are quite a vessel of information, Mike.
Lots of trivia.
Here's one from John. Was the Marin Portuguese community in the 19th century financially supportive of the family back in the Azores?
Yes. I mean, the Azores were not a particularly wealthy part of Portugal. Their land was limited there. You had large families and primogeniture. And so when people would leave the Azores and come to America, they would definitely feel it part of the obligation to try to support their families back in the Azores. And one minor example of that was the dress that Dorothy Mirage Williams shared with her relatives back in the Azores. Today, the Azores have become much more an international center. Growing up in Hawaii, I always felt that America, the continent, was far away and didn't care that much about Hawaii. And so in that sense, I have some great sympathy for the Azorians who over the years felt that Portugal was really far away and didn't care much about the Azorians.
All right. Here's one for Marjorie. Are you familiar with the Tachera Ranch in Bolinas? Wonderful talk, she says. Thanks.
Thanks. Again, I think there are a couple of Tachera families in Bolinas. Now, the common way, the traditional way of spelling that name is T-E-I-X-E-I-R-A, Tachera. But in Bolinas, I think Bill spells it T-A-C-H-E-R-R-A. And I think there are a couple of brothers there, and there is a Tachera ranch. There was also a Tachera ranch in Olima. So there are a couple of different ranches and a couple of different spellings of that one name in play there in the Bolinas-Olima area.
Okay, let me just take a quick cruise through here. Here's one. This is from Cassandra. Is there a good place to get sweetbread in Marin outside of the festival?
Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any. However, a 45-minute drive from where I'm sitting right now, you will arrive at the Nine Islands Bakery in Santa Rosa, which I heard a rumor the other day might be going out of business, but that is the closest place you can drive. And Hawaiian, from the Big Island, I can tell you the Nine Islands Bakery, they're actually from São Miguel, but their sweetbread, whatever recipe they use, is just like I used to eat growing up in Hawaii. And it's excellent, particularly with French toast, if I might put a plug in for using sweetbread for French toast. Otherwise, you'd have to go over probably to Silva Bakery in Hayward over in the East Bay. There are quite a few more opportunities in the East Bay, but the traffic is heavier. Okay, Nine Islands Bakery.
Lisa, I've seen your question, but I'm going to save you for last because it's a good one. Here's one from Lucy. Do you happen to know the story of the crown that the Queen carries during the festa?
Well, the legend, or among the legends I've heard of Queen Isabel, was that when she created the Holy Ghost Festival, she actually donated her crown to be used to crown a poor person, and that was part of the festa. And so that's the significance, I think, of the crown itself. In the Azores, I mentioned earlier that the whole thing with queens is an American invention. That didn't traditionally happen in the festas in the Azores. Sometimes a young man would be crowned, or even an adult man who had helped to perhaps organize the festa. But the use of the crown, I think, goes back to Queen Isabel.
Do you have time to tell us the legend of Queen Isabel? I mean, we just flirted with that, but...
Well, the roses. So, yeah. Okay, quickly. So King Dennis, or King Dinesh, comes off kind of badly in this particular legend, because supposedly Queen Isabel, this paragon of virtue and always thinking of the poor, was always trying to donate everything she had to the poor and encourage King Dinesh to do so as well. And he was not completely on board with that program. And so supposedly he had told the queen that she couldn't take any more food to the poor. And so on a cold winter night, Queen Isabel decided she was going to violate the king's decree. And she set out from the palace, possibly in Coimbra, with some food in her cloak that she was going to donate to the poor. And as she stepped into the dark courtyard on her way out of the castle, the king had been lying in wait for her, and he leapt out and he said, "What do you have under your cape?" And the queen knew she was caught, but she thought, and she said, "Well, it's roses." And the king says, "Ha, ha, ha. course it's not. I mean, where would you find roses in the middle of winter? And Queen Isabel opened her cape, and the food had miraculously been transformed into roses and spilled forth onto the courtyard floor. And so ever since then, Queen Isabel has been associated with roses.
And free food, too.
Not free food, too. But we always encourage donations. But we certainly do encourage people to come to the Festa. It's great to come see how, it's a lot of fun. You see families running around, and then the food is actually pretty good.
And I also encourage people to take the walking tour. You were so kind to take a few historians the other day, including me, on a walking tour through Sausalito, which is like the Tetris game of moving buildings. I had no idea how many buildings had been moved around on the surface of that town, many of them Portuguese.
That's part of our heritage for sure, moving buildings to Sausalito.
And you also pointed out, Sausalito is just such a lovely place now, so pristine, but, in its heyday, as you described, it was filthy, actually, noisy.
It was probably a fairly disgusting place to live with the trains, the automobiles, because remember, before 1937, when they opened the bridge, anybody who wanted to travel north and south or come from San Francisco had to take the auto ferry to Sausalito, and then they would drive out of Sausalito north. And so traffic jams were incredible in Sausalito. The trains were running, the mills were whirring. It was not quite the
sewage was
first destination it is today.
The sewage was collecting. Yes. Okay. That was a great walk, and it's just lovely to see Sausalito with fresh eyes. I want to thank you for that. Here's a question from Lisa. She says, what's the best way to reach you regarding the dairy research?
Oh, well, I should have pointed it out on the slide, but you can simply send me an email at history@idesst.org. history@idesst.org. So you'll see it on the last slide when the video comes out, and it's also included, that same contact information, in the handout.
I'm going to read two comments which reflect many other comments, not to embarrass you, but to thank you. Thank you, Mike. This is from Maryland. Thank you, Mike, for bringing alive the Portuguese families and heritage and culture. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And here's another one from Dave. Fabulous presentation. Thanks for all the research and your good heart.
Thank you so much to both of you. And I should just say that I couldn't have done this without help from so many people. When I started, I knew nothing. I knew a little bit more to now, but most of what I think I know today has been taught to me by many others. And so this is very much a team effort.
Yes. So sorry, go on.
As is all history.
Yes. So let me just pull up. I've lost my page to go on, so we'll give a second. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to add before we go into closing?
I can't think of anything. Again, I really welcome people contacting me. I do have quite a bit of information about Portuguese who have lived in Marin now. And so if people are doing genealogical research, I'm happy to share what I know. And I always really, really, really love to hear from people whose families were here in Marin, because at this point of our research, that is maybe the only real way we have to learn more about the history of all of those folks who worked on the dairies.
Okay, well, thanks again, Mike, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here tonight.
I hope to go on another history walk with you soon.
Thank you.
For those of you who have enjoyed our weekly email history vignettes composed by local historian Chuck Oldenburg, You'll be pleased to hear that those vignettes have been bound into a new book called Mill Valley History Vignettes, Volume 2. It's a compilation of 152 of Chuck's most recent vignettes. And Volume 2 makes a wonderful companion to Chuck's original book, Mill Valley History Vignettes, which continues to be available in our Mill Valley Historical Society bookstore. Also available in our bookstore is Adventures of Two Coast Miwok Children, written by my dear friend and fellow board member, Betty Girk. This beautiful book brings alive Marin County's Coast Miwok legacy as it explores the daily lives of a real boy and girl who lived in neighboring villages on San Francisco Bay in the late 1700s. The little boy in the story is named Week Musa, but he would grow up to be known as Chief Marin, Marin County's namesake. It's a precious and very beautiful book and a great gift for children and adults. Well, that about wraps it up. Again, special thanks to Mike for your wonderful presentation and to Natalie for her technical support and for her everything support. So happy to have her back. And to all of you in the audience for your interest and patronage. Please join us next month, that's April 5th, 2023, for the History of the Mill Valley Historical Society with historian Tim Amex. Till then, be well and good night.